ready when you are, Eddie.
So, everyone, welcome to our second season, second podcast of The Moral Economy. I'm one of your hosts, Eddie Giuseppe.
I'm another host, Andrew.
I am your other host, Navaz.
We always have so many hosts. I'm Chell. I'm a host.
And today we're gonna.
Chell says that all the time. I am also a host.
Today we're gonna be talking about surveillance. The inspiration for this episode was an article that was published on The Intercept on January 23rd of this year. It's called "Why Do We Expose Ourselves?" It talks about a book that was recently released called "Exposed."
A book we didn't read.
Right. Exposed, Desire, and Disobedience in the Digital Age by Bernard Harcourt. And reading this article, we were inspired to first talk about, I guess, the history, maybe, of different techniques of surveillance.
Sure, yeah.
And so Andrew's going to talk about George Orwell's 1984 and also The Panopticon by Jeremy Bentham, and also popularized by Foucault.
Yeah, so actually I'm going to be talking about thought crime. From this article they talked about thought crime, and so I got very interested in it. I wanted to actually write something else completely different, but you're getting thought crime. So thought crime is an important concept popularized in George Orwell's 1949 novel, 1984. If you don't hear them, they're laughing because I couldn't say that before. A prototype of thought crime is found in G.K. Chesterton's 1908 novel, The Man Who Was Thursday, A Nightmare. The novel follows Gabriel Syme, who infiltrates an anarchist group's inner circle only to find that there are no anarchists. Syme's first encounter with thought crime and the concept of the philosophical policeman is when he is recruited by the Man in Blue. To quote, "The work of the philosophical policeman," replied the Man in Blue, "is at once bolder and more subtle than that of the ordinary detective. The ordinary detective goes to pothouses to arrest thieves. We go to artistic tea parties to detect pessimists. The ordinary detective discovers from a ledger or a diary that a crime has been committed. We discover from a book of sonnets that a crime will be committed. We have to trace the origin of those dreadful thoughts that drive men on at last to intellectual fanaticism and intellectual crime." Orwell's 1984 has philosophical policemen of its own. These are known as the thought police. In the novel, the thought police can monitor anyone through the telescreens, two-way televisions that are in every room of every home and office and around every corner. In this way, the thought police can monitor all crime think, Orwell's equivalent of the thought crime. And I won't be going into the novel 1984. You really should all read it.
I've read it.
I've technically not read it. I listened to the audiobook.
We all read it.
Back to the thought police. To quote, "There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everyone all the time. But at any rate, they could plug in your wire whenever they wanted to. You had to did live, from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and except in darkness, every movement scrutinized." Besides the thought police, Orwell expands on the concept of thought crime in two important aspects. The first is the introduction of Big Brother. "Big Brother is watching you." This is the quotation that even people who do not know the novel probably do know. Big Brother is the face of the party, which names Big Brother as its founder and leader, and yet from the novel it is not clear whether Big Brother exists or not. Nonetheless, his face is to be found everywhere, on posters and on the screen. In this way, Big Brother is much the embodiment of Orwell's concept of doublethink, the simultaneous belief in two contradictory things, a necessary construct in a world full of contradiction. And indeed, you are being watched. Perhaps not all the time, but there is no telling when someone will be on the other side of the telescreen. Big Brother is therefore tied into the concept of the panopticon, a theoretical prison devised by Samuel and Jeremy Bentham and mostly elaborated upon by the latter. The panopticon consists of two circular concentric buildings. Prisoners are kept in the outer building, whose inner walls are made entirely of glass, so that a relatively small number of prison guards in the inner building, called the inspection house, can see everything that any given prisoner is doing at any given moment. Theoretically, the inspection house could be occupied by only one guard. There is no way that a single guard could watch all of the inmates all the time, but as with the telescreens of 1984, the key to the panopticon is that none of the inmates can know if they are being watched. The other aspect that Orwell introduces is newspeak, a variant of the English language created by the party in order to control the minds of the members of the party. If you do not know newspeak, then you may already have committed a thought crime. A key characteristic of newspeak is that its vocabulary is constantly changing, meaning what might have been acceptable to say one day is a thought crime the next. The creators of newspeak purposefully eliminate all meaning in the language by cutting out synonyms and antonyms, or replacing words such as bad with ungood, better with gooder, and so on. By combining Big Brother, newspeak, and the thought police, Orwell paints a grim and sinister totalitarian landscape controlled through brute force, manipulation, and surveillance. As mentioned, the presence of Big Brother's face everywhere, and the question whether he really exists or not, is the essence of doublethink, reinforced by all-seeing telescreens, which confine your actions in the external physical world. Newspeak implants Big Brother into your mind, a precursor perhaps to the film Inception, so that you are even constrained in the internal psychological world. And before I go on, I will ask, so how realistic is 1984 in our world?
I think it's much worse.
Pretty damn realistic, right?
Yeah, I think so too.
I'd say
Because I would say that 1984 is always sort of evoked when talking about government and surveillance, and frankly, I actually think that thought crime in the real world is actually much more sinister.
Yeah, I think Orwell would be stunned as to how bad it actually is nowadays.
Yeah. So to go on, to explain my argument, at home and abroad there is a disproportionate surveillance of leftist and civil rights activists, and I really want to emphasize that point. It's disproportionate surveillance of civil rights, leftist and civil rights activists, not right-wing militias and stuff like that. Forget the NSA and mass surveillance for a moment and try to put yourselves in the shoes of people who are continuously spied upon and arrested on the basis of their beliefs that we should see and treat each other as equals, or just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Police helicopters dragnet smartphone data as they fly over colored communities. Police and federal agents alike infiltrate peaceful environmentalist organizations, posing as activists and then attempting and failing to incite violence at protests and demonstrations. Police in New York City actively seek out poor, disadvantaged Muslim men, promise them money to carry out a crime, supply them with fake weapons, and then arrest them if the men agree. Meanwhile, armed all-white militias take over federal property, police and gun-carrying civilians kill black people en masse, and harass and jail countless other black and brown people for minor violations or made-up reasons. For this reason, I argue that the concept of thought crime nowadays goes deeper than criminal acts or so-called criminal speech, and goes much deeper than 1984. Certain ways of thinking and perceived intentions are deemed criminal in our society, but it's not just the police that deem them so. Black Lives Matter, a simple phrase pointing out the systemic violence towards black Americans in the United States, is a good example of actually existing thought crime. Racists in the US, both cops and in the general public, emphasize all lives matter, arguing that Black Lives Matter is an attempt by blacks to put themselves in a privileged position over whites. Black Lives Matter, in other words, is perceived as just another subversive message in a long line of subversive messages originating from the black community. Things like, I have a dream, or you can't separate peace from freedom because no one can be at peace unless he has his freedom. The first quote being from
Martin
Luther King, the second quote being from Malcolm X. These messages are subversive not because they seek privilege and entitlements over whites, but rather because they dare to demand equality and justice while being black. In the real world, thought crime is, in my mind, much more sinister than in 1984 or The Man Who Was Thursday. In the United States, you commit a thought crime when you have the audacity to be a free thinker with black skin. Elsewhere in the world, notably Turkey, Egypt, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, each military allies to the United States, journalists and activists are locked up, beaten, and even beheaded for daring to voice opposition to state oppression. What are we to make of it when our allies, for instance, Saudi Arabia, an autocracy that recently executed 70 criminals, among them mere dissidents, is a chair of the UN Human Rights Council, that Turkey is strengthening ties to the EU while conducting a bombing campaign against Kurdish civilians, that Egypt is the single largest detainer of journalists and continually receives billions of dollars of military aid from the US, and that since 2011, Bahrain, home of the United States' Fifth Fleet, has, with the help of Saudi Arabia, battled against its own civilians in order to quell what would have been its own addition to the Arab Spring. Let us remember that the things for which journalists and activists in these countries are punished are the very things that the UN Charter for Human Rights and the United States Constitution explicitly protect. Again, in the real world, a thought crime is worse than in 1984, for it is none other than the belief that you are actually allowed to exercise the rights that you are supposedly guaranteed. And on this note, I would like to leave it to Eddie.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue to what I'm going to be talking about. And so we just heard a few techniques of surveillance, or I guess maybe the attempt of mass control. What I'm going to talk about is Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's propaganda model. It was first spoken about or written about in their 1988 Manufacturing Consent. There was a subsequent documentary, also called Manufacturing Consent. And I want to start off with a quote that actually the book starts off with, and I think it's a good way to frame my talk about the model. It's by John Milton. They who have put out the people's eyes reproach them of their tears. Now, the propaganda model maps out the media's performance given its relationship with institutional structures. This model claims that the media serves powerful societal interests, controlling and financing them. These interests have agendas and principles who shape and constrain media policy by selecting the right type of thinking personnel and editors, and by, quote, the journalist's internalization of priorities and definitions of newsworthiness that conform to the institution's policy. This view also claims that media's owners and advertising funders serve as the definers of the news. They also produce what they call flack, which I'll talk about later. It's the ability to complain about the media's treatment of the news and the dominant ideologies. Now, of course, it doesn't mean, according to their model, that there isn't dissent. There is, of course, dissent, and if anything, that's what makes it so nefarious. So there's dissent about the accepted viewpoint. It's allowed, but it's always kept within bounds, never critical enough to interfere with the agenda. And as far as the effects of the media on the public, there are influences, but that's always a matter of degree. And so the propaganda model describes forces that shape what the media does, not that it's always effective. Since the media is a business, the bottom line is the holy grail. This results in what I call the obfuscation between the editorial board and the advertising board, the advertising departments. So plenty of studies, and we'll put it on the podcast, so if you're checking us out on YouTube, you'll see this. Studies show that a substantial portion of press releases come from the public relations department and not even the editorial department. And so, as a personal note, I recently met a young lady, a journalist in Brazil, who told me that she's really disheartened about her profession because a lot of the press releases do in fact come from the PR department and not the editorial board. So this is going on, it seems, all over the world. And maybe Navaz, you also worked as a journalist for some time. Was it different? Yeah, it was
definitely. A lot of the news material is basically PRs, press releases that you get from PR managers of all kinds of things, of entities, of corporations, of even the government departments. The information department, as you call it.
And we can think of it. This has been going on for thousands of years, right? Even in ancient times, the Romans. It's the ancient technique of games of the circus, where entertainment is provided to create a political apathy and distraction to the masses in order to maintain the status quo.
Super Bowl.
Which was yesterday, right?
Yeah,
Which was also great because Beyonce did an amazing thing.
Oh yeah, that's true.
But we won't get into that.
Let's stay on topic here. Although that's a great conversation to have. So, the propaganda model explains why the owners of media don't present us with the kind of material that would probably most people would be interested in. So less sex, less violence, less about consumption, but more about things that concern us in our daily lives, right? I think we would all want that, but we just don't get it, okay? Of course, this is talk. There's plenty of case examples, and I'll get to that actually at the end. First, let's get to the nitty-gritty of the propaganda model. Briefly, media entertains, amuses, informs, and inculcates individuals to certain values, beliefs, and codes of behavior which integrate us with our society and our institutions. The systemic propaganda is needed in a world where power and wealth is concentrated. So because of this, it's difficult to see systemic propaganda's uses when media is private and censorship is illegal, like it is in the US. This is especially the case when the media occasionally exposes government and corporate malfeasance. Now, the propaganda model focuses on the effects of this inequality of wealth and power, and its, of course, subsequent effects on the media. And it works with certain filters. So I'm going to briefly spell out the filters, and then I'll get into the different techniques that these filters use. So the first filter is the size, concentrated ownership, owner wealth, and profit orientation of the dominant mass media firms. 2, advertising as a primary income source of the mass media. 3, the reliance of the media on information provided by government, business, and so-called experts, funded and approved by these primary sources and agents of power. 4, flack, as they call it. It's a means of disciplining the media. And 5, what I call just fear. When they initially published this book, they called it anti-communism. Nowadays, I think it's more appropriate to think of it as terrorism, which is a control mechanism of the media. These filters are self-supporting. They come across as natural to anchors and presenters of the media because they fix the premises of discourse, interpretation, and definition of what's newsworthy. They fix them within bounds, and they appear to be objective because of this. These constraints are fundamentally built into the system, rendering alternative media outlets unimaginable. And as a side note, that's the reason why when this book was initially published in '88, there's about over 50 to 60 different major big-time media outlets. Today, there's only 6. Right? And according to some stats, 6 companies control 90% of what we hear, see, and read in the US. Okay, so more about ownership. Perfect, actually. That's the ownership. This is as a result of the market integration with the media. The market pressures the media for profits. Banks and investors are also shareholders, which doesn't necessarily mean that they control them, but it does imply that banks do have an influence. And we'll post on the YouTube video articles and charts of this. TV companies and networks. No, we won't.
No, we definitely will now.
Yeah, okay. I got the
That's how you get it done.
I mean, it'll be on the website actually, not the YouTube.
Why not? You can't post it on the.
I'll do it for
pictures.
YouTube too, but it's the website. We want people to go to the website.
Isn't that what it's called?
Well, if you want, I could just give you I have like a PowerPoint, and you could just post it on.
Yeah, totally. I want to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Makes
Less
it
work
easier
for me.
Okay. So, also, TV companies and networks require government licenses and franchises and are thus potentially subject to government control or harassment. Furthermore, there's a revolving door between government and media. So you've probably heard on the news, revolving door between government and big corporations. Well, also it's the same case for media. We'll have more. There's another article on that we're going to post. And lastly, one more thing. As anyone that knows about investments, you have to diversify your portfolio. So if you have a big company, you probably want to not put all your eggs in the same basket. GE and Westinghouse do that with military research and development and the nuclear production of weapons and other things necessary for nuclear weapons. That's the first filter. Second filter is advertising. Advertising is needed for media companies to cover costs of paper production or any kind of production. If not, they fail. That's why so many smaller newspapers and media agencies failed in the 19th and 20th century. In turn, media companies provide to their advertisers consumers. They use what they call a CAP, or a client audience profile, which is an evaluation of clients to match them with products, where, of course, clients with buying power are important. And this is what's interesting. They have to deliver to the audience, to a specific kind of audience that has money, and this in turn means that it's an audience that has some kind of influence in society, generally speaking. So here we're talking about maybe not the 1%ers, but maybe the top 10%.
10%, yeah. You could use The Economist as an it's a very good example. It is being read by the elite all over the world.
The Economist, I thought it was an advertising magazine.
Yeah, it does have all these, fancy ads from all these
Really
companies
does.
that, could, all the people who could afford a Rolex, for example,
And in this sense, we can maybe even look at the news that's provided in these newspapers and magazines as just filler material to connect advertisers to
their
clients.
clients.
You could tie it into the class war and say, the advertising in magazines for wealthy people, is helping to determine the way the wealthy people are supposed to see the world, whereas the advertising in magazines for poor people is also contributing to their, particular, worldview or the worldview they're supposed to hold. And so that's, in a way, separating, the two classes with ideology. Not to force conflict, but to minimize conflict.
In the interest of the podcast, I'm going to say let's not talk about class war right now.
Okay.
That's for another podcast.
Okay.
But it's I just want to mention that these advertisers pressure, in a sense, these media outlets to frame news in a way that doesn't affect the buyer mood. What does that mean? That means that they don't want them as much as possible to show a world that's too complex, too controversial, but rather, mildly entertaining. The consumer is what is sold to the advertiser, but not any consumer. It's the purchasing power consumer. I said that already. So it's advertising. Third filter, sourcing. And this is, to me, the one that's especially notorious. And this is the one that I had no idea about. I mean, I guess I kind of did, but I really didn't. Media is dependent on the government for news. Media can't be everywhere at once, even the biggest ones. I mean, BBC, New York Times, they can't be everywhere at once. So they station their reporters in different media or information nodes. 10 Downing Street, the Pentagon, the White House, the State Department, the police departments, town halls, so on and so forth. If they're too critical of these government information, they can be cut off from that information. And information is the media's lifeblood. They need so much information every day. News workers are predisposed, and this is a quote. It's from Manufacturing Consent. News workers are predisposed to treat bureaucratic accounts as factual because news personnel participate in upholding a normative order of authorized knowers in the society. Reporters operate with the attitude that officials ought to know what is their job to know. In particular, a news worker will recognize an official's claim to knowledge not merely as a claim, but as a credible, competent piece of knowledge. This amounts to a moral division of labor. Officials have and give the facts. Reporters merely get them. I'm going to repeat that. This amounts to a moral division of labor. Officials have and give the facts. Reporters merely get them. Furthermore, for sourcing, it's cheaper for these media companies, right? It prevents them from getting into sticky libel lawsuits. It prevents them from doing further research into the credibility of the information. And that's because the government spends hundreds of millions of dollars with thousands of information employees to get all of this stuff.
But it's important that we need to know that, this is the information that the government wants the media to give out to the public. There's a lot of information that whistleblowers have come out with, and they're persecuted for that.
Right.
So we need to make a distinction. The government is not giving out any information,
of course,
through these nodes planted in government defense departments or the people who have these people as their sources.
Yeah. No, thank you for pointing that out, because for me, that's automatically assumed, and that's for me. I don't know if this is because I was raised in the U.S., but there's this very common idea that the media is the fourth branch of government, right?
Yeah.
But what I think this propaganda model is showing is that this notion that it is the fourth branch of government that is supposed to test the veracity of what the government does is actually not so true.
It's a subordinate branch.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, but in any democracy, that's the most reliable source of information for citizens, for the populace, for the voters, to be able to inform and to make informed choices about, the way their individual intellectual lives are going to be decided. And if the source of information is somehow controlled by the people who already run the government, there you have it.
Yeah.
And so manufacturing consent, as the name says,
Yeah, and so if the news agency or certain reporters in a news agency are too critical of the government, this news agency gets cut off, right? And that's, as I mentioned, that's their lifeblood. So that's a powerful tool, a powerful mechanism that the government has, or the establishment, as Herman and Chomsky call it. Now, there's certain techniques with sourcing that is used to frame news. One of them dates back from the First World War, and that's pretty much just inundating the media with many reports to just overflow the news with so much information so that people are, in a sense, almost confused. They don't know what to look at. They have their attention distracted. Another one is to heighten the importance of one occurrence to kind of put in the background another one that might be even more important. Because what's been heightened might even be false, for all we know. And so an example is in the 80s, Nicaraguan elections, the time of the Contra scandal with Reagan. During the elections, which was an important election for Nicaragua, the people wanted something, the American government wanted something else. They heightened the importance of delivery of certain missiles to Nicaragua, which ended up not being ever substantiated. Also, another technique they use by the government is supplying of experts, or by big companies. So I made a mistake. I think I make a mistake to differentiate between the government and big corporations. I think that's something that's that I shouldn't do.
Is it really the same?
Yeah. For me, there's a wedlock between
You
big
libertarian.
governments. Yeah. Well, that's what's interesting, I think, about the kind of discourse that Bernie Sanders is providing us, although I'm not a big fan of everything he does, but I'm happy that he's allowing a certain discourse to arise in the mainstream, which, tries to combine the idea of government and
to get at that big corporations do actually influence politics, not only influence but actually control politics.
Yeah, and if anything, it's wrong to make a distinction between them, probably. Yeah.
In today's world,
Yeah. So the funding of think tanks, experts who push us and publish a certain view towards issues which toke the establishment line. And as you correctly pointed out earlier, Henry Kissinger, I think, is a good figure to think of. This is a quote by Kissinger, former State Department, head of the State Department. The quote, in the age of the expert, the constituency of the expert is those who have a vested interest in commonly held opinions. Elaborating and defining its consensus at a high level has, after all, made him an expert. The fourth filter is flack. It's what they call flack. Flack is the ability and capacity to create a negative response to certain media statements or programs. Because of flack, advertisers can withdraw their patronage for fear of a boycott. Of course, flack comes from power, and it has two arms. It's direct or indirect. An example of direct flack would be a phone call from the White House to Anderson Cooper, or from the FCC asking for the documents used to make a program, or from sponsors threatening retaliation. An example of indirect flack could work by complaining to constituents, shareholders, about a certain media company, or making institutional ads doing the same thing, or funding think tanks undermining the so-called said media company, or political campaigns, etc. Lastly, the fifth filter is what I call fear, what the book called anti-communism, and now the new editions have called it, something like terrorism. I think Andrew made a good example of it. So Black Lives Matter, that's another one. So let's just, I think, call it fear-mongering.
I think it could also, we could look at it as an ideological red line that, that the media or nobody has to step.
Well,
it could take different ideological red lines.
They often call it moral panic, for instance, as well.
Yeah.
That is that line that you, and under any circumstances, do not have to breach.
Yeah, and I think it uses a concept's fuzziness, as certain people call it, to really, put people in a certain camp that we don't even know what this camp is, and they just use fear. So it's a rhetoric that dichotomizes, marginalizes unwanted opinions, because it dumbs down the complex realities, and it appeals to our human passions and instincts for protection and defense. And I just want to end this brief explanation of Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's propaganda model by a quote by Chomsky. So I think when we talked about the fifth filter, we should have brought in all this other stuff. The way artificial fears are created with a dual purpose. Partly to get rid of people you don't like, but partly to frighten the rest. Because if people are frightened, they will accept authority. So, with that, we can get into different applications of this propaganda model, because this has been already applied for decades. And actually, I think that's what I wanted to do. We could do that. We could maybe bring that up in discussion.
I think this is something that we're really trying to do away with this podcast, that the monotony of big media, trying to cut it off for our listeners, trying to give them a more intelligent perspective, I believe.
Maybe just like a quick example, just to tie it together, because it's kind of fun to do. So take a hypothetical situation. This doesn't quite fit the model perfectly, yeah?
Well, should we maybe do a real example to put...
Well, I like the hypothetical just because it makes it very clear how all of these things tie in together. I came up with it while you were talking. So.
Okay. Thanks for listening to me.
I made you this button there. I think it's kind of... like that. Okay, good. So imagine a scenario where the owner of a major media outlet has diversified his portfolio and now also sells handguns. We're taking the setting is the United States, and maybe this media company has a very sort of right-wing audience, let's say, and so it would be in the interest of the owner of the media company to hype any kind of gun control proposal from the side of Obama as something that's going to eliminate the ability or the freedom of Americans to purchase weapons, in order that that his audience, who we know supports these sort of views, run out and buy as many weapons as possible. So now he's getting. Plus, he can also advertise for these weapons in his magazine. So now he's getting money from the advertisement because the gun companies that he owns know that they're going to make a lot of money getting people to go buy their guns, and he's getting money from his gun company because people are buying the guns, and he's also setting the whole sort of political dialogue in the background about.
Jill, what's hypothetical about this? I mean, this is probably what happened.
Well, it could. I mean, it's hypothetical in the sense
we're
that
going to look this up.
I don't have any.
I'd say it's hypothetical in the sense that we've not heard any news about
about it actually happening.
How could we? Because
not that it's impossible. I think that it's a very
he's spoken about
probable,
it. He's spoken about it. But again, I want to point out the fact that with this whole commercialization and this corporatization of the media. What's happening with this the sanctity of the journalistic profession, that the way that it was thought of as being an integral part of a democracy is that it's just another product that you consume. That's it.
Yeah.
And it has to go and you watch a television or read a newspaper just because you want to consume that sort of information that it gives to you. And in that sense, this sort of plays into their editorial policy, and they do not come out with sort of stories that would offend an audience of sorts, which is why you have very strict, editorial boards that the Economist, if you want to read it, they're going to take a very liberal, free market sort of line. The Guardian could speak a bit of its mind, be a little bit of more progressive. And what have you, we could go out. Fox News is the other extreme example.
Well, that's why there's almost no voice for sort of counter mainstream ideologies. Like somebody who wants to go out there and talk about the positive aspects of anarchism. Is just not going to have any kind of voice. And you can think about it. Can you imagine a situation where suddenly major media outlets decided to have and the anarchists' opinion section and let's get some opinions from some anarchists to see what they think about this. That would never happen.
Of course
anarchists for the mainstream media are basically terrorists because they just never
I wanted to point out
between the two.
I wanted to point out that well before the communists, the anarchists were the ones who were demonized in the public's mind.
They're still demonized. We only can't imagine them being demonized because we are them. But most people still, when they think of anarchists, they think of gun-toting, black mask-wearing, bomb-throwing, crazy people, just
or
like
chaos.
That's anarchy.
Okay.
But the terrorists who are also black mask-wearing, gun-toting, bomb-carrying, crazy people. But these are legitimate, philosophical points of view in the philosophy of politics. But they are given no voice. And this is an extreme example. We're comparing mainstream democracy with anarchism, but even within the democratic tradition, there's tons of voices that are minimum.
Look at Bernie Sanders. Look at Bernie Sanders.
He was attacked.
He's been attacked recently. He's recently a lot.
Attacked by being marginalized initially.
Yeah, that was the initial method.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that after that last debate, I'm sorry if I
no, go ahead.
And initially, before this last New Hampshire debate that happened a few days ago, and on the national polls, he was trailing Hillary Clinton by at least 30%. After that national debate in New Hampshire, he cut the gap within 1 day. And the reason is not that, some skeptics might say of this model, regular people want to consume these things that the media is giving us. They're just appealing to the supply, to the demand. They're supplying us with the demand. Yeah. But that's BS. Because studies show that actually regular people would want things that are actually less about violence, less about sex, and more about things that actually concern us in our communities and society. So when Chomsky gets on national television and he talks about all the things that he's talking about finance reform, about Wall Street taking advantage of government, people actually like this kind of stuff. This is what we want.
Yeah, but that's the point that I made about people wanting to consume the information, and one of the other things that I recently heard about it was what this hampers is that once we get into this habit of consuming the sort of information that we want to consume, and this plays into the editorial policy of how viewership ratings or the publication of print media, how many copies of them are sold, plays into is it stifles this critical debate. All these algorithms that social media gives out. Facebook shows on the information that you've previously accessed. It just cuts down the information. That
it even follows your mouse. Tracks your mouse.
That's what I'm saying.
Basically,
well,
what you're looking at.
They can cater it to you so well. Well, it's this weird feedback loop, right? Because they're getting better and better at catering the kind of information you receive based on you as a demographic.
Yeah.
But simultaneously, by catering that information to you, there's just a ton of information that you just don't get.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. When it's hampering this critical debate, that would be otherwise there.
Yeah, that would otherwise be there.
Exactly.
Yeah, but because you're a demographic and I have to make money off of you, then I'm going to deliver you the message that you want.
Exactly.
Yeah, and of course, in this weird way, I determine it, though maybe not directly determine that message, but sort of indirectly determine it. By I don't know where the ball starts, but where it starts rolling, but at some point, by delivering you what you want, I'm denying you, a whole realm of critical thought. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like for the television channels, it's the viewership ratings. How many people are switched to a channel, particularly when a certain program is being played.
Yeah,
with the publication is the number of copies sold, when they carry a particular
And imagine
story.
advertising to that group, that demographic. And so then now we have demographic information. We're going to advertise to it. And so then you have the advertising companies, the companies that, or not the but the companies that are being advertised. And maybe then they have an interest in the kind of message that you're delivering to this audience.
Of course. That's one of the filters, right?
Yeah, exactly.
No, but this also plays out into this sort of, the replay of what you want to consume. Because once, they know, okay, this show was there and it was being watched by 10 million people. Now that's a good market to sell this product, I don't know.
Yeah.
But then,
and then also, all of this is the filters. All of this is just us repeat, but it's really interesting because and then on top of it, the information you're receiving is from experts. It's an authority.
Yeah.
It's information that you should be believing because you saw it on the fucking news, right?
Oh yeah,
excuse my language. And so then people go out, after having this like extremely diluted and manipulated message given to them, and they repeat it to their friends as though it were the truth because they imagine that the source of that message is an authority on what they're talking about, because it's the news, but it's not the news, it's the news in collusion with the government, in collusion with business.
It's the news speak.
Yeah, the news speak.
And I want to get back to that, what Andrew earlier spoke to us about.
Before you do, I just want to mention something. It seems like you guys find this pretty intuitive, this model.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've all read Chomsky, actually. So
and in fact,
not read.
No.
Oh, well,
outside of some of his
even if you've listened
I've
to
seen
his talks,
documentary though.
Even if you've seen his talks, he uses this model quite often, and it seems. To me, it seems pretty intuitive. It seems that to you guys, it seems to be intuitive. Let's have a point of contact, just as some case examples to think about this to see if it works.
Vietnam War. We could talk about that. How that went into play. And
but let's look at this one. You got some numbers in front of you.
I have some numbers. Yeah. So in the book they actually have a couple comparisons, and what I forgot to mention was the difference of how the media has this intertwined relationship with the U.S. government and special interests, because you would think that if two set of atrocities are committed around the world, despite their relationship to the U.S. government, the American media would present it in the same light. According to this propaganda model, it would say that no, it wouldn't present it in the same light. Let's see. So we have, in the 1990s, we had abuses committed both by Turkey and Iraq on the Kurds. Iraq was not a friend in the 90s of the U.S. Turkey was. What was the media response to this? Well, let's just look at headlines. We could even look at articles, a number of editions of op-eds doing the same thing, or even just the words applied of genocide, the word genocide applied to these two conflicts. Turks and the Kurds, the Iraqis and the Kurds. One being a friend of the U.S., the other one not. So, the friend of the U.S., how many times did a front page article get on American media? From 1990 to 1999. One time. How about the Iraqi abuses on the Kurds? Not a friend of the U.S. From 1990 to 1999, on the front page of a paper, 24 times. How many deaths were committed by Saddam Hussein on the Kurds around this time? Generally speaking, around a few thousands. How many deaths were committed by the Turkish regime to the Kurds around the same period of time? We're talking about over 30,000 deaths, over 2 million refugees. Only one front page article in a little under 10 years. Yeah. And this is just for the word genocide, for these two conflicts within this time period. We could also look at other things, like, for example, the word torture for waterboarding. All the way up until 2002, American media sources mentioned the word torture for waterboarding dozens of times. Not a problem. From 2002 on, when the U.S. started using waterboarding, how many times did we use the word torture for waterboarding? A little less than a handful of times. And this goes to many different cases. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's how, this sort of information, like I said, it goes on and play into what the government wants us to believe in, wants us to know, and in that way act. But I wanted to go back to what Andrew was talking about, thought crimes. It was interesting to read recently about how Bernie Sanders is coming out as democratic socialism, and I was actually seeing on people talk about, oh, he's a socialist, and socialism is bad, and
which is not true, by the way.
Yeah.
That he's a socialist.
But
or that socialism is bad.
Right. Or that socialism is bad.
Yeah. But that thing, it's that is how it's been fed to people, and that it's a thought crime to think that socialism or democratic socialism could mean something actually positive or progressive.
Yeah, to wear it on your sleeve, basically.
Yeah.
As they say in the United States.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Like to be
be open about it.
To be open about it. Or on that note, I think we've come full circle, so I think I'd like to end the podcast. I thank our listeners for listening. Until next week.
Keep listening
make the
to
democratic
us.
choice.
Yes. Keep listening to us.
Yeah, keep listening to us.
And make the
We're not big media.
We're just going to keep on going.
When it's all said and done, you will find no place to hide, nowhere to run.